my honor to have here with me Patrick Moore, one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, and you've made a journey over the years, as have many of us. You were one of the environmental activists in the 60s, 70s, 80s who led the campaigns against the whaling and the killing of the baby seals, etc. But you're being honored here at the climate conference for some other contributions that show considerable change of heart. One of the things that you said yesterday in your talk was that we should be wanting more CO2 in our atmosphere. So let's just jump in right there. Why? That seems to be quite a different take from what most of the other so-called experts on climate change are saying.
It certainly is, and I haven't had a change in heart. I've been true to science and truth all my life. And one of the reasons I had to leave Greenpeace after 15 years on the front lines in the top committee of the organization, I was an international director for the last 6 years I was there, was because they strayed from science and truth and logic into misinformation, sensationalism, fear tactics, and went completely political. So I just couldn't stay with that, because I have a background in science. I have a Bachelor of Science in biology and a PhD in ecology. It was actually while I was doing my PhD that I joined the original little group in the church basement in Vancouver that became Greenpeace. So I was with it from the beginning, and we started out in a church basement and ended up with $100 million a year coming in because of what we did and the support that people gave us for doing it. Saving the whales was really where we really made it on the world stage. And it's because we went out and did something, not just marching in the street with placards. We went out on the high seas and got in front of the whaling harpoons to protect the whales, and that got us on TV around the world. So Greenpeace really was the originator of the direct action approach to getting people's attention to issues. But what matters is the issue, not so much the tactic. And Greenpeace started adopting policies on issues that I simply could not accept. For example, just before I left, the argument that I got in with them, they wanted to have a campaign to ban chlorine worldwide because it's toxic. And of course it's toxic, but one of the reasons it's the most important element for public health and medicine is because it's toxic to bacteria that are trying to kill us. That's why we put it in our drinking water and our swimming pools. And most people don't realize it, but most of our synthetic medicines are made with chlorine chemistry. So they wouldn't listen to me, because it ended up I was the only international director with a formal science education. The rest of them were political activists, social activists, which is fine in their own right, but they were basically liberal arts majors without a good grounding in chemistry and biology, and we were beginning to take on the toxics issues and the genetics issues and these things where you actually do need to have some science to make it a good judgment.
And the consequences of not having it, outlawing the chlorine, could be plagues worldwide in drinking water and epidemics.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, there's no doubt about it that adding chlorine to drinking water was the biggest advance in the history of public health. In the whole of human history. It saved hundreds of millions of people. It's one of the reasons why the population has grown, and some people will say, well, maybe that shouldn't be happening. And that's the other reason I left Greenpeace. We started with a humanitarian orientation to stop all-out nuclear war. That's why we chose nuclear testing as our focus at the beginning. And that meant to try to save civilization, humans. And that's the piece in Greenpeace. But as we moved along and went into the whaling and sealing and other campaigns, Greenpeace kind of lost the peace part, and it just became the green part, which is the nature part of it, which is good in its own right. But now all of a sudden humans were portrayed as the enemies of nature, the enemies of the earth. And I just don't see things that way. I know we're part of nature, we come from nature, Mother Earth has created all of life and we're part of it. And so separating us from the rest of nature, especially teaching children that we are the bad thing and nature's the good thing, is really subverting the first law of ecology, which is that we're all one and all interconnected. So I couldn't stay with that. And then the chlorine issue at a specific level made me had to leave. So I left then before the climate change issue had even become a big issue. But I soon got involved in it because British Columbia, my home province in Canada, issued a report on all of the emissions of carbon dioxide, and they pegged the forest industry as the worst culprit, worse than transportation. And that's because the forest industry is dealing with biomass energy. And so I wrote an essay at that point called "Are All Carbon Atoms Created Equal?" Well, of course they are at a physical level, but at a policy level, it's true that we treat fossil fuel carbon differently from biomass carbon because biomass carbon is renewable. And when you cut a tree, as long as you plant another one there, the carbon that goes into the atmosphere from the one you cut, if you burn it for energy, is reabsorbed by the new tree. So even the IPCC and the Kyoto and all of those international agreements recognize that forestry is basically carbon neutral. Whereas transportation, the cars aren't sucking up any CO2, they're just putting it out. And so it's a one-way street with our use of fossil fuels, because fossil fuels are not being renewed at the rate we are burning them or anything even close to it. It's basically 100% net emission. So I got involved and created a group called the BC Carbon Project and brought all the people around the table that were involved in the emissions regulation and sequestration of carbon in my province. And for 3 years, we worked to develop a common understanding on the subject. So that's where I got my grounding. I've never believed that there is a scientific proof that carbon dioxide and global warming are related causally. There is a correlation through some of the history of the Earth between the two, but that's often because a third factor or many other factors are affecting them both simultaneously.
But causation has never been shown.
It's never been shown on a global basis. And actually, the reason it hasn't been is partly because of the limitation of the scientific method itself. You can't do statistics on a sample of one, and there's only one planet Earth going through real time. You also have so many variables that cannot be controlled. And in order to really do science and experimentation, you have to be able to control all the variables except the one you're looking at. So if we had 50 planet Earths, all exactly the same, and everything stayed the same except we varied the CO2 on each of the 50 up and down from what it is now, and look at what happens to the climate, then you might be able to draw some conclusions and maybe even do a statistical analysis, because a sample of 50 would be possibly good enough to do that within some limits. So we don't have that, and we never will have it. And so the idea that we can make a computer model that will predict the future of the Earth's climate is beyond the scientific method. It is basically pretending that there is actually a crystal ball and that it's called a climate model. There is no crystal ball. It is a mythical object, just like the Holy Grail. You know, it's an interesting concept that you could look into a glass ball or look into a computer and see the future. But the world is so complex, the universe is so much more complex than we even understand, that we will never be able to do that.
It is science fiction. You point out, as do Sherwood and so many other scientists, that we are actually in a CO2 starved era now, and that we would actually benefit from higher CO2 levels.
Yes, a lot of people say that CO2 is higher now than it has been for the last 800,000 years. This is true, but that's only about a quarter of the way back into the present ice age, which began 2.5 million years ago. It's not even a quarter of the way back. So during this ice age, the Pleistocene, CO2 has been lower than it has been than almost all the history of modern life, which goes back 550 million years to the Cambrian explosion, when multicellular life emerged and large organisms like us and plants came to be. Before that, it was all single cells and microscopic for 3.5 billion years. People don't understand the Cambrian explosion was such an incredible phenomenon that occurred in the evolution of life. And it happened about 550 million years ago. Read Stephen Jay Gould's A Wonderful Life if you want to understand the history of evolution. And at that time, when life emerged as multicellular and bigger animals and plants, the CO2 was between 10 and 20 times higher than it is today. And it gradually came down as forests grew and plankton bloomed and sucked the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, to where in the late Carboniferous, about 350 million years ago, CO2 came down to about as low as it is today for the first time in the history of the Earth. Then it went back up again. We don't know why, but it did. It went back up to 2,000–3,000 parts per million. And starting about 150 million years ago, it started a slow, steady descent from 2,000 parts per million down to about 260. And all through the present Pleistocene era, which may have been brought on partially by lack of CO2. I'm not arguing that CO2 doesn't sometimes have an impact on the way the temperature regime goes, because it is a greenhouse gas. And if all else was equal, CO2 would be, if you fluctuated CO2, it would be one of the main drivers. But all else is not equal. There's Earth's wobbles, and there's the tilt, and there's the oceanography, and there's solar flares, and there's cosmic rays. There's a lot of things that affect the atmosphere of the Earth, and therefore the Earth's climate. But the fact is, it has been lower now during this last Pleistocene ice age than it has been for virtually all of the history of life. And if you Google optimum CO2 concentration for plant growth, simple as that, you will find that it's about 1,500 parts per million, which is nearly 4 times higher than it is now. In other words, all of the plants on Earth today are starving for CO2 in terms of how much they would actually like to have in order to grow at an optimum level. We also see that even with the small increase in CO2 that we have produced through our fossil fuel consumption, that the entire planet is getting greener, and there is more vegetation today than there was just 50 years ago because of the fertilization effect of carbon dioxide. And if there's one thing that people have to know who are concerned about carbon dioxide being a negative, is that CO2 is actually the most important food for all life on Earth.